do in a minute. But first, we'll start off with a story like we always do. Did you have an answer earlier to what would you say to your 18-year-old self? I know some of you aren't 18. Think about your younger self then. For many of us, that's a key moment in life that we look back on now. What would you say to your 18-year-old self? I heard somebody say, listen to your parents. There was that one that was out there. I heard somebody else say, listen to your Oma. What's an Oma? That's a grandma. Yeah, listen to your grandma. There was a moment when I was 18 years old when I was sitting in a car with my grandfather. And this moment is burned into my memory for several reasons. He had come to pick me up, and we were driving from, if you know Washington State at all, from Olympia, Washington down to Portland, Oregon. So it was about 2.5, well, no, like 3 or 3.5 hours the way my grandfather drove. And he drove that way. Actually, I'm a lot like him. My family will back me up on this. When he would talk, he would slow down. Yeah, that's what I do too. I go real slow. My wife, I'll be talking up a storm, and my wife will say, do you know that you're going 40 kilometers an hour? Yeah, speed up. So he would slow down when he was talking, and this trip, he talked almost the entire 3.5 hours to me. Now, number one, my grandfather could talk way too much, and I also share that trait. But also, so I was conflicted in this moment. As we were driving, I knew even then that this was a key moment in my life. He was telling me things that he had learned over a lifetime of experience. He was trying to speak into my life. I was trying to listen. I was conflicted. Part of me thought, I really want to listen. I know that right now I'm receiving wisdom from my grandfather. And another part of me thought, Grandpa, be quiet. You're talking too much. And I don't know if I agree with all the things that you're saying. He was actually saying some things to me. He was telling me, don't put your hope in this. Don't put your hope in that. Don't live your life. He was telling me in detail how not to live my life for my career. How not to live my life for what people around me think right now. What people think of me. How to not live my life trying to achieve great things. That's not what it's all about. And he was telling me what, in his view, he had learned, his experience in the world and with God. He was telling me what the real key was, what I should be living my life for. And I heard the words, and I thought, he's probably right, but no, it can't be. I was in the grip of all those things at that time, wanting to do something that was really impressive with my life. That was probably my biggest temptation. And so in those moments, I look back, I halfway listened, I halfway didn't, but there was a moment in my life when someone was trying to impart to me wisdom, and I desperately needed it. Have you ever had a moment like that? What are the moments, as you think back on your life, what are the moments where maybe that's already happened for you? Did you listen? Are you listening now? We're going to come back to that illustration. We're going to jump in today into the book of John, which is a book in the Bible. So, if you have been a Christian for a long time, this is a fantastic place for you to be. If you've read the book of John 20 times or more in your life, this is a fantastic place for you to be because we are going to be taking a fresh look at this book. And as we go through today's message, I think you're going to see, those of you who've read this book many, many times, you're going to see how God is going to use this time that we have. I am convinced because he led us into this series very clearly. He's going to use this time to give us a fresh look. And so we're going to be asking him to do that. But also, if you have never read this book before, if you're not sure if God is real, you're not sure if Jesus is anybody other than somebody who lived in history, perhaps, this is a great place for you to be as well. Because as we look at this book, you are who it was written for. Both groups are who it was written for. We're going to see, today we're going to think carefully and bring before our minds strongly a vision of this man, John, who wrote the book. And what it was like for him as he was writing down all these things that he has experienced and seen when Jesus was on earth. And as we look at what his mindset was, we're going to see that he was longing for other people around him, people who'd been Christians for a long time, and people who didn't yet know, even if God was real. He was longing deeply for them to see what was right in front of them. That Jesus, this man that he had known in his youth, was still here, even though we couldn't see him. And that you could enter into a new life, the life you were really made for, through him. And that's a reality that you could walk in. This is what was in John's heart. And so we'll get to that at the end. And so we're going to bring to our minds, today's message is going to be a little different. We're going to bring to our minds this picture. It's going to be mostly a story about John in this moment. We're going to imagine what it was like for him to write this book and all the things he's thinking back on. And we're going to go into the book in a couple of places, but we're only actually going to read from it in one place as we get toward the end of the message. So right now, just a couple things you need to know about the book. It is in your Bible. If you've got a Bible, anybody got a paper Bible these days? Anybody bring one? Taya, yes. Look, all we've got is Gen Z and the baby boomers. That's all. The middle generations didn't bring their paper Bible. Look at that. No, some of them did. If you got a paper Bible, so it's in there. It's most of the way toward the end. And it's not very long, right? Like if you're at home, you can tell me what you got. Send me a picture if you got your paper Bible. Paper Bibles are awesome. We're going to be talking about those today. It's not very long, actually, this book. Just like that. Let's see if I can do this without. That's it. So how long would it take you to read through this book of John? Actually, that was a little more. I actually grabbed some pages of the book of Acts as well. So that was even a little longer. How long do you think it'd take you to read through the book of John? That depends on how fast you read. But probably just like 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, maybe, if you're reading slow and carefully. So one of the things we're going to challenge you to do a number of times during this series, but here's your first challenge. Before next Sunday, I challenge you to just sit down and read the book of John. How much time do you spend watching TV every week? You don't have to answer, but if you just took probably a small portion of the time you spend watching TV or on your phone, and you just sat down with maybe a paper Bible or maybe the Bible on your phone. If you want to find it on your phone, you can just click the word that says John. You could easily read through the whole book. And that's how it was intended to be. He wrote this in a way that you could sit down and simply read it or listen to someone else read it. That's what many people did in those early days when he wrote it. Okay? So that's challenge number 1. And that's where it is in your Bible. Another thing you should know about this, so John wrote the book. There's a little bit of debate about when he wrote it. But we're going to say, I think the very best evidence shows that he wrote it right around the year 100. So the year 100 AD. He wrote it after he had written one other book. Does anybody know what it is? If you're at home, you can write it in on the live stream if you have some idea of what it is. What book would he have written before this? Anybody, any thoughts in the room? Oh, everybody's whispering. We can be interactive here a little bit. Yeah, Revelation. It seems very likely to me that he wrote this after he wrote the book of Revelation, and we know very clearly that he wrote the book of Revelation in either the year 95 or 96. That book we can date quite precisely because of when and which emperor he was sent to exile under. So now it's a little bit after that. And that book, I don't really think he planned Revelation very much. Anybody ever read the book of Revelation? It's a weird one. We'll go through it sometime. But that book, I think he just saw a vision and just wrote it down. Probably he wrote it all in a day. He just got it onto paper as fast as he could before he forgot it. But this book is a little bit different. In this book, he had to carefully think back. He had to bring back memories from a long time before. If he wrote it in 100 AD, and the book is about the time when Jesus was on earth, what years was Jesus alive on earth and walking around? We're going back there to the early 30s. All right? So imagine someone around the year 2000 thinking back and writing a book about what had happened in their childhood in the 1930s. That's the kind of distance we're talking about here. It doesn't mean that he doesn't remember it properly. That's not my point at all. He remembers it. It's burned into who he is. He has taught these things again and again his whole life. But he is reaching back throughout his whole lifetime, remembering. That's part of what's going on here. Now, as we go through this series, this is the last thing I'll tell you, and then we're going to jump into imagining John writing this. As we go through this series, we're not going to talk about things like, is this book, was it actually written by John? There is some debate about that out there. We're not going to talk about things like, does it record really what truly happened? There is debate about it because there's always debate about books of the Bible. Books of the Bible are not neutral, are they? If some other historical book from way back in time, like think of what's a historical book that you think of from a long time ago, thousands of years ago? Somebody throw a name out that's not part of the Bible. Yeah, the Odyssey, right? Written by Homer. There's not much debate about whether that was really written by Homer. There's a little bit maybe, but not much because it doesn't matter if it was really written by Homer. There's not much debate about whether what happens in it is true or not because it's obviously not true in any literal sense, right? And it doesn't affect your life if it's true. But the books of the Bible are 100% different. Because if they're written by who they say they were written by, and if they're true, then every human being on earth must deal with them. And they affect our lives dramatically. The whole world is a different place if they're true or if they're not. So there will always be debates about whether the Bible is true or not. And if you're not sure, if that's something you're struggling with, I'm teaching a whole class on it, leading a whole class that will be discussion-based this term, and I would encourage you to join that. But we're not going to be talking about that during this series. We're not going to assume necessarily that everything John thinks is true. We're going to see what he thinks and what he remembers. But we are going to assume that it was written by him because all the best evidence shows that it was. If it weren't a book of the Bible, there would be no debate about this book. There is tons of evidence to show it was written by who it says it was written by. And we're going to assume that everything he wrote is an accurate record of what happened when he was walking around with Jesus. And I think as we read through it, and as you read through it, you're going to see that it feels like that. If you read through that book this week, you're going to walk away from it going, you know what? That feels like what would happen if someone I knew, a good writer perhaps, sat down and tried to write what actually happened when they were in their teenage years. John was a teenager when this book was written. We don't know exactly how old. Maybe he was 13, maybe he was 15, maybe he was 18. This is a moment he's looking back to when someone spoke into his life, the true meaning of life. Was he going to listen? Well, he did. He followed it the rest of his life. The person who spoke it into his life was Jesus Christ himself. All right. So now, join me. We're going to imagine John writing this book. So you can imagine you're not physically there, but you're seeing it. You're maybe a floating invisible camera or something, or your spirit. You're moving into the room where John is writing this book. What do you see? The first thing you see as you enter this room, it's not a very elaborate room. It's small. It's maybe got a wooden floor, maybe a little bit of wood on the walls, but there's clay there as well. There's not very much furniture in the room, partly because many pieces of furniture that we're used to hadn't even been invented. Things like desks hadn't been invented yet. Isn't that weird? Things like couches. They had very low couches, perhaps. So it wasn't like this, no big chair, maybe a very low chair, stool that he's sitting on. And you see in this room a very old man who's lived a hard life in a lot of ways. I don't know exactly what his body and his face looked like at this point, but man, he has been through a lot. And he's sitting probably on the floor in the room, and that looks natural for him. He's used to sitting on the floor. He's got perhaps a box or a low stool in front of him. And on that low stool, he's got some papers that he's writing in. And you can see this old man who's been through a great deal. He's maybe in his late 80s or maybe early 90s, something like that. And you can see that as he writes, he is full of emotion as he writes this book. He's not the only one in the room. There's two other people in the room with him. And they're both young men, very young, maybe even still older teenagers. Maybe two, let's imagine that they're 18 years old. Two 18-year-old, would you call them men or boys? What would you call an 18-year-old? Two 18-year-old men, two young men. And they're sitting in the room with him. And what are they doing? Well, sometimes they're helping him. Sometimes he gets too tired to even hold the quill. And so sometimes he dictates to them and they write for him. Other times they're going out and they're grabbing stuff for him. You know, he needs food. He actually doesn't eat very often. In fact, half the time they bring him food, he says weird stuff to them like, I have food that you don't know anything about. At one point, he makes them write down those words. They're words that he remembered from Jesus. So they're learning from him as well. He's trying to teach them. That's part of why he's got them in the room. The other reason he's got them in the room is that they are who he's writing for. There have been other stories already written about the life of Jesus. The other books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have been out. They've been in publication for a long time. All the churches have them. But now, this new generation, he feels like they're missing something. Do you ever feel like the new generation is missing something? He feels like they're missing something, and so he is writing a book to connect with them. He's writing a book to show them who Jesus is and that Jesus is right there with them. Now, they're also trying to help him. They've upped his technology game a little bit. He tried to write a scroll, and they were like, John, you can't write a scroll, man. That's no good anymore. You gotta bind this scroll together. In fact, they came up with a new way for him to write this thing. He's actually writing one of the first times in history in a book, what we would call a book. Pieces of paper sewn together because these young men in front of him were like, this is the new way, man. You can't write on parchment scrolls anymore. That's ridiculous. So they've helped him quite a bit. As he writes and has them take turns writing, he thinks back through his long life. Almost everyone who he's known, who have been his closest friends, they're all gone. He is, in fact, in many ways, the sole survivor from his generation. And this is part of the reason some of the time he's writing, he's full of joy and laughing out loud. Other times, there are tears streaming down his wrinkled face as he thinks about all the people who have gone ahead of them. He knows he's going to see them again. But they're not there with him right now. If we can make sure those doors are closed, that'd be awesome. Thank you, guys. So as he thinks back, he is full of emotion, and he thinks back, the first memory will jump back to, suddenly he flashes back to that day when his friend Jesus, who he had been with, his teacher, was dying on a cross. He thinks back to that day. That day is burned in his memory. He was so scared that day. He had no idea what was happening. He ran away multiple times. He was weeping. He didn't know what to do. And he thinks back to that moment when he'd managed to get up his courage enough to come back close to the cross. And then the Marys, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, who had all been followers of Jesus, had gone and grabbed him and pulled him over to the foot of the cross. You got to go and say goodbye to him at least. And he thinks back to that moment when Jesus, dying on the cross, had looked down at him and said to him, "Son, this is your mother." And looked at his own mother, Mary, and said, "This is now your son." And Jesus had given John the job of taking care of his mom. He thinks back to that memory and he cries for a few minutes before he can go on writing, just because he misses Mary. That changed his life. especially later after his own brother and best friend was executed by the government. Just a few years after Jesus, Mary became his constant companion and a source of strength for him and guidance. He hasn't seen her in a long time. She died maybe 30 years before this. His mind flashes forward. He remembers Mary. He remembers Peter. He remembers how a few weeks after that moment at the cross, a few weeks later when they saw Jesus alive again, and all the emotions of that, he remembers how he was terrified that Jesus wasn't going to stay. And he remembers that moment when he and Peter, it was a hilarious moment for John, although it was terrifying for Peter. He remembers how there was that moment where Jesus was telling Peter how Peter was going to die. It's a little bit sadistic that it was hilarious for John, but it was. Jesus had told Peter, when you were young, you went where you wanted. You dressed yourself and you made your own decisions. When you're old, other people are going to dress you and take you where you do not want to go. And Jesus made clear to Peter that he was telling him that he was going to die a death at the hands of violent people, the Romans, in fact. And he had died at this point. He had been gone for more than 30 years as well. And he remembers how in that moment Peter was so upset. John's kind of giggling about it. He remembers how Peter was so upset, and he turned from Jesus, and he couldn't handle this idea that he was going to be executed someday. He turned from Jesus and he looked at John, who was 18. Peter was like 35 years old at this point. And he says, Jesus, well, what about John? If I'm going to die at the hands of the authorities, what about John? And Jesus had looked back at Peter and said, Peter, that's none of your business. What does it matter? Worry about what I'm asking you to do, Peter. What would it matter to you? It wouldn't matter to you if I decided that John would never die. If I keep him alive until I return, that has nothing to do with you, Peter. And now John thinks back through his long life and cracks up hysterically as he's writing. Everybody in the year 100 where he's writing, there's this rumor that everybody thinks he's immortal and he can never die. Seriously, he goes to different churches and he visits them and they think this is the man who will never die. And they've got some reasons to think that. John thinks back through his long life about all the people who have tried to kill him. There are half a dozen different people who have tried to kill him. He thinks back to the craziest moment when the Emperor Diocletian had tried to execute him in the middle of the Roman Colosseum, and it didn't work. That was a surreal moment for John. The crowds had been silenced as he sang songs of worship while the Roman officers were trying to execute him, and he wouldn't die. Everyone thinks he's almost like he's a celebrity now. He's almost like a superhero, but he knows it has nothing to do with him. The only reason he's alive is because his friend Jesus spoke a few words. And whatever his friend Jesus speaks happens. He knows it. He'd been sent into exile after that moment, and now he was back. But he knows he's near the end of his life. He knows that he is going to die. He's going to die of old age, in fact. His mind flashes forward from there to his friend Thomas. He thinks of Thomas because he's looking at these two young men who are in front of him. And these two young men were a lot like Thomas when he found them a couple of years before. Thomas, back in 33, Thomas had followed Jesus and he had desperately wanted to become more like Jesus, to learn from him. He had desperately wanted to have faith and trust that whatever Jesus said was going to happen. But when Jesus died, even though he had predicted that he would come back to life, Thomas could not get himself to believe it. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that God's power could raise Jesus from the dead and change the world, but he just couldn't bring himself to really believe. And John remembers that moment when his friend Thomas was struggling back and forth. And then he remembers the moment when Jesus showed up right in front of Thomas and showed him his wounds, showed him the scar in his side. And Thomas suddenly went from just wanting to believe to knowing that Jesus is alive and right there with him. And John knows, and John has lived his whole life knowing that it's not just that way for Thomas. It's not just that way for Thomas because Thomas could see Jesus physically, but it can still be that way today. And so when John found these two young men who were in the church and they wanted to believe that God's power was right there with him, right there around them, helping them, but they were struggling, they had doubts. John had taken these two young men under his wing, and he had introduced them to his friend. John had been so scared when he was young that when Jesus rose from the dead, he had been so scared that Jesus was going to disappear and leave him. He hadn't realized then that Jesus would never leave him again. In that moment, in fact, John can feel the presence of his friend Jesus just the same as when he was there physically with him. He talks to him under his breath. For a minute, his hand starts to shake because his body is dying and he can hardly write. And he says to his friend Jesus, "Can you make my hand stop shaking? You told me to write this. Help me." And his hand goes back to normal. And he continues. He looks at the two young men who are in front of him. And now I'm going to tell you who they are. He looks at these two young men and he smiles. He doesn't even remember what their original names were. John has renamed both of them. When they came and they met Jesus for the first time and their lives were transformed, they're now growing by leaps and bounds. He knows they have a long way to go. But he's given them new names because they are new creations. They're new people. They've been born again. And so one of them really reminds John of himself when he was young. This guy is super fiery. We can call him Fiery. He's super fiery. In fact, when this young man, when he's old, one day the Roman authorities will threaten to kill him for following Jesus. And when they threaten him, he will stand up and say, "I dare you, drag me to the Colosseum, please." That's how he's going to respond. He's fiery just like John had been when he was a young man. And so, John had named him. He had named him Ignatius, which means fiery. This young man doesn't know it yet, but he will eventually go on to become the bishop or the overseer, the pastor of the city of Antioch, not too far from where they're writing the book at that moment. The other young man has a very different makeup. He's a shepherd. He's someone who just really cares for the people around him. He's full of love. And he is someone who has been intimately following Jesus. He speaks to Jesus all the time now that he knows him. And he wants to be closer and closer to him. And this is his heart cry all the time. And so one day, as John had been writing the book, actually, and this young man had been helping him, he had been writing some words from Jesus that are now today found in John chapter 15. And Jesus, he'd been remembering how Jesus said, "I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit." In the Greek language that he was writing in at that moment, he wrote down the words, "Polou karpon," much fruit. And suddenly he heard a voice speak to him. That's the name of this young man who's next to you. And so he turned to the young man and said, "Your name is Polycarp, Polycarpus, because as you rest in Christ, you will bear much fruit." Polycarp would eventually go on to become the bishop of a city called Smyrna, also in this same area. And many, many people, their lives would be restored. He would be looked to as one who had great wisdom, and he also would eventually be killed by the Roman authorities. As he looks at these young men, he thinks about the future. He knows that his time is almost done. He's almost done with the book. In fact, he'll only write one more chapter after the spot that he's at right at that moment. He's almost finished with this great and maybe last work that God is asking him to do before he gets to go and be with all these people who've gone ahead of them. You might think he's sad that they died. He's sad that he misses them, but he is longing to be where they are. He wishes that he'd been executed 35 years before, like many of his friends were. But he looks out at this generation, this new generation, represented by these two young men. He thinks about many young men and young women who he knows, and he knows what they need. They need to know that Jesus, his old friend, is actually there with them. And that they can enter into a life with him if they just believe. If they just put their trust in him every day. And so he writes these words that are now found in John chapter 20. As he begins to wrap up his great book, he says this: Jesus, my friend Jesus, performed many other signs. I've told you about dozens of them, dozens of the miracles that happened, many other signs in the presence of his disciples, in the presence of my friends, and in my presence, we saw them. He performed many others that are not recorded in this book. I couldn't possibly write it all down. But these that I have I have written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen one, the anointed one, the Son of God. Notice how he translates it. This is what his generation called it, the Messiah. Now he comes up with a new term, or a different term that he reemphasizes for the new generation. He's the Son of God. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. This is the cry of John's heart as he looks at his two young friends, Ignatius and Polycarp. As he thinks about all the future history of the world that's coming, his longing is that we would see that Jesus is right there with us. We're going to go through his book this fall. We're going to look at it in a fresh way. We're going to imagine ourselves right there standing with John when all of these things happened. We're going to learn from Jesus himself how to find him, because he's here with us now. Most people can't see him, but he's right here. We're going to learn from John how to rely on him in our everyday life, how to experiment with Jesus even and find out. Jesus, at one point in this book, John's going to tell us, Jesus said, try me out. Try it out and see if I don't show up in your life. Try it out and see if I'm not real. We're going to experiment with him and find out how to do this in real life, in our actual lives. Maybe as you think about this and you go away and you pray, there are going to be a few people that are like your Ignatius and Polycarp, people that you are longing to see have their eyes opened, people that you are longing that they would enter into this new life through Jesus. I would encourage you to go get them. John is about to send these guys out to go get other people. And that's what he's asking us to do as well. You don't have to force them to come. Just pray for them. Just build a relationship with them. And just invite them. And trust that God is with us by his Holy Spirit. We're going to pray now, and we'll continue in worship.